Well, welcome everyone to Legends of Business News, Cebu's new conversation series with pioneers in business journalism. I'm Caleb Silver, the president of Cebu and the editor-in-chief of Investopedia. I'd like to welcome Cebu members and guests at tonight's event. And if you're just meeting us for the first time, Cebu is the Society for Advancing Business Editing and Writing. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing business journalism, and we've been around since 1964, so we know a few legends in our industry. I'm so thrilled about tonight's conversation with one of those legends, and I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. Carol Loomis worked at Fortune for 60 years before her retirement in 2014 at the age of 85, and she helped define the magazine and set the standards for excellence in business journalism. She helped launch the very first iteration of the Fortune 500 list in 1955. She wrote hundreds of stories for the magazine, dozens of cover stories, and mentored so many journalists along the way. A lot of them are with us here tonight. She's won all the big awards in our industry, including the Loeb Award and Cebu's own Distinguished Achievement Award, but her true legacy is the excellence, the true excellence of her work and the joy she brought to so many of her colleagues she worked with over the years. I know a lot of them are on this conversation series tonight. We're so happy to have you with us. I understand that members of Carol's family are here as well. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you for your part in helping create this legend and being around it. What an honor for us to have you with us. I brought in an ace to have this conversation with Carol, a legend in her own right. Stephanie Mehta is the editor-in-chief of Fast Company and the newly named CEO of Mansueto Ventures. So congratulations, Stephanie. Delighted to have you here with us tonight. And you worked at Fortune for 14 years, many of those right down the hall from Carol. And if you were like me, anytime you walked past her office, you kind of tiptoed past to see what was going on with the stacks of reports and all the magazines in there and all the newspapers. It was like a shrine in there. And I would just walk real slow when I walked past it. But now you're the boss at Mansueto Ventures. You've been the editor at Fast Company. You've worked across our industry, Stephanie. So happy to have you here as part of this conversation as well. And before I hand the mic over to you, however, we do have a special message from a very special guest and a huge fan of Carol Loomis's. We're all big fans, but this guy's a big fan. When he caught wind that Cebu was having this conversation and including her in our Legends of Business News interview series, he wanted to send a video message. He picked up his iPhone and he sent me a message, and I'd like you to play it now if we can, please.
Hi, Stephanie. If the subject is business, you've really picked the right person in Carol Loomis. She knows the subject forward and backward. I don't know what there was in the water at Cold Camp, Missouri, where she grew up, but I'd like to get the rights to that water because if I can package and sell it, I could become rich.
Yeah, I think he needed a little help becoming rich, but Warren Buffett wanted to send a message in, and there it is. I know you guys have a long-standing friendship, and he was delighted to know that we were doing this. I'm not going to take any more of your time. I'm grabbing a glass of wine here. I'm going to sit back and enjoy this conversation with Carol Loomis, someone I've admired for such a long time. Thank you, Carol, for being here. Thank you, Stephanie, for doing this. Thanks to the Cebu crew for putting this on. And folks, let's enjoy a legend of business news, Carol Loomis.
Thank you so much, Caleb, for that great introduction. And of course, thank you to Warren Buffett. It's always a little intimidating for me to interview a journalist, but it's especially intimidating to interview a journalist who is renowned for leaving no stone unturned before she conducts an interview or sits down to write a story. We're so lucky to have Carol Loomis with us this evening, and we're also lucky that we'll have a chance to hear from you and have you ask your questions toward the end of the conversation. So if you have a question for Carol that we don't get to in our Q&A, please drop it in the chat, and we will definitely try to get to as many questions as we can. Carol, it's so wonderful to see you. How are you this evening?
Oh, well, I'm fine, Stephanie, and so nice to be here and being interviewed by you. I'm honored.
We've got a lot of ground to cover, and so we'll try to whiz through your career as quickly as possible. But I did come prepared. I did read just about everything I could about Carol Loomis before I got here, and of course I've read your collected works since I became interested in journalism. Now, you were an admirer of Time and Life magazines when you were a journalism student. How did you become interested in Fortune and business journalism?
It was sort of a roundabout my getting interested. First of all, I read a very, very good speech by a Fortune editor that had appeared in some business magazine. and he made the place sound like a heaven to be at. Secondly, I was working at this point in Newton, Iowa for the Maytag Company as editor of a house organ. And while I was in Newton, I had a boyfriend who read Fortune, and that naturally got me interested in it as well. And so I sort of shifted my interest in working for Time Inc., which had always been there from Time and Life to Fortune, and particularly when that is the only one that eventually offered me a job. So it was a marriage made in heaven for me.
Once you got to Fortune, what was it about the subject matter that you found so compelling? What was it about what you were researching and ultimately writing about that captured your imagination?
Well, of course, first I was struck by how little I knew about the subject and how much I had to learn. And I realized that I was surrounded by wonderful journalists who could help me to understand. And then as I got deeper into it, and as I learned how to read financial statements, which became very important to me, and as I had something to do with setting up, a little bit to do with setting up the Fortune 500, I just became totally captivated by covering business. Never would have suspected that when I was in the journalism school at Missouri, but I certainly did as I made my way through Maytag and got to Fortune.
And what do you consider your first big story at Fortune? What was the story that you think helped you establish yourself as a journalist?
Well, don't forget that I spent a lot of years at Fortune working in the sort of a starting job as a researcher before I got to actually write a story. And then I was very surprised by the managing editor calling me in and telling me he was going to ask me to start writing for the investment column. We were starting a new investment column. And now you're asking me my first really important story. Well, it was about Wells Rich Lawrence. And the reason it was important is that, first of all, it was one of my first stories. And secondly, when I turned in my first draft, my managing editor liked it so much that he circulated it to the staff, and I couldn't get over that. I don't think the staff could either. But anyway, maybe the Wells Rich Lawrence story was my first most memorable story. But after that, I got deeply into other kinds of business stories.
Was there something for you about the ability to tell stories in magazine form, what people now call long form, that really appealed to your style of reporting and writing? I mean, while you were coming up, there were obviously newspapers covering business, there was radio, there were lots of places where you could have, done a lot of quick hit type of journalism. Was there something about magazines that appealed to you, even going back to your journalism school days, where you were clearly drawn to Time and Life?
Well, I was drawn to the idea of a magazine career. And I was just lucky to be able to get an offer at Fortune. I began to think that Fortune was the ideal avenue for telling a business story, because we were given lots of time to research a story. We were allowed to travel to wherever that was. And then we had wonderful editors stepping in and helping us produce really good stories. So I still think that is an ideal way to tell a business story.
whenever I speak to aspiring business journalists, as I say, I've always said I encourage them to read the collected works of Carol Loomis, in part because your stories are actually a really good roadmap for reporting. Everything is meticulously sourced, and you kind of take the reader along with you as you are revealing information. Would you consider that style of writing, was that sort of a Fortune house style when you started writing for Fortune, or is that a voice that you developed over the years for your own journalism?
Well, I think that the atmosphere was there. Fortune had many great journalists when I joined it, had many great art people. So I think they deserve the reputation for telling a story right. I sort of leaped on the bandwagon and tried to do it, and I probably was, I certainly wanted to do as much reporting as I could, and I sometimes probably overdid it. But how do you know what you don't need to know until you know it? So anyway, I came into a great heritage, and it just made to order for me.
Yeah. Who was your Carol Loomis? If you were the Carol Loomis to so many generations of journalists who look to your work and look to you as a mentor, who helped shape you as a journalist in your years at Fortune?
Well, the first editor that did most of my stories, or my first manuscripts, was the editor on them, was Dan Seligman, who was just a wonderful, wonderful editor, and certainly someone who taught me all sorts of things. I remember him telling me once, don't use that pompous word, be idiomatic. And so I think that's wonderful advice. And I was lucky enough to have Dan for my editor during very many of my early stories. And then I had other editors, all of whom seemed good to me. And I still believe that one of Fortune's secrets was great editors.
Yeah. It's been interesting to see modern popular culture capture what they perceived the workplaces and newsrooms of the 50s and 60s to have been like. If you look at television shows and movies, newsrooms of the 50s and 60s are portrayed as places without boundaries. How does the pop culture portrait of Time Inc. of 50 years ago sort of square with your memories?
Well, I guess it never seemed like pop culture to me. I was amazed by this place that I was in, and by the morgue, which we had at the time, and that was so wonderful. And I just thought I had landed by all sorts of accidents in just the highest place I could imagine. And so I don't think that I thought about it in terms of pop culture at all, because it didn't seem that way to me.
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about drinking in the office, smoking in the office, romances in the office. Was it as loose a culture as I think, my kids, when I talk to them about newsrooms, they still think of it as, these sort of wildly promiscuous places.
Well, I did say in kind of the biography I wrote for Fortune that we had one guy who was definitely somewhat of a threat to any research. At that time, we had writers and researchers. The writers were all men, the researchers were all women. If you'd go on a trip with them, which you did, if they had any bad habits, like this guy did, like trying to romance you no matter what happens, then that was unfortunate, and it was well known to all the researchers at Fortune, including me. So forewarned, what happened when he tried to take me on was I slapped him, and that was the end of it.
You also famously sued the Economic Club of New York for its policy excluding women as guests and members. The suit was ultimately unsuccessful, but the policy did change. Do you feel like you contributed to that decision?
I do. I think that my bringing a suit made them think about whether they were doing the right thing. They had never allowed women at their big dinners, and usually monthly. And when I called up from Fortune and said that I was going to be the person who came to that dinner, I was told, no, you're not coming because we don't allow women. And that got me on the phone to the head of to the secretary, I think it was, of the Economic Club. And he said to me, famously, because every friend I had who ever went to Smith resents this. He said, what we don't want to have is any little Smith girls who are looking for a free dinner and an evening with 1,200 men in black tie. So I said told him I didn't go to Smith, and he let me come. That was sort of my joke. And anyway, the University Club soon after, and I'm sure it was after my suing them and failing, they realized that they needed to catch up with reality, and they allowed women to go. And I remember that I and a Fortune editor whom you knew, Wyndham Robertson, were allowed to sit alongside, like it was a balcony. We were allowed to sit alongside one night at a Economic Club dinner. And then soon after that, the Economic Club changed its policies altogether. And now I think there's been a woman who's been president of the Economic Club, if I'm not wrong, and there certainly have been many speakers. So there you are, the world changed.
But you ultimately never joined the Economic Club, as I understand it.
I don't remember. Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, they did invite me, and I turned them down. But I had 2 kids, and going to Economic Club dinners was not high on my list at that time.
Or any time.
Yes.
Carol, I would love to talk with you a little bit about the hard-hitting stories that you've written. And I know you don't set out to tell a hard-hitting story, but oftentimes the reporting leads you in that direction. Most notably, you wrote at least 3 stories that were really critical of Time Inc.'s parent company during the time you worked there. I'm curious if you got any kind of reaction from higher ups that suggested people were displeased.
No. Well, there might have been reaction to my editors, but none of it ever reached me. And I honestly did not think it was fair that I would insist on talking to major companies on the record when Time Inc. wouldn't allow me to do that in one instance when they said that they wouldn't do that. So in that case, I said, well, I just won't talk to you. And the story that talked about the merger and how it wasn't going to work was certainly the most important of these. And I got no direct criticism from that. But much, much later, I talked to one principal in that, and he said to me, and then you wrote your story so that I know it was important in what was going on behind the scenes.
And that story turned out to be obviously incredibly prescient. But again, like all of your journalism, you laid out the case for why the valuation was faulty math. I mean, it
Right.
was spelled out there. It was and they couldn't have quibbled with they didn't certainly quibble with any of the facts.
Right. They did not. Never, as far as I know.
Carol, with all of those stories that you've worked on, I've got to ask, did you ever have that pit in your stomach the night before a story goes to press? I think some of us, wake up in a cold sweat wondering, did I get the name spelled right? Did I get everything right? For someone of your caliber, did you ever have those moments where you kind of sat bolt upright thinking, oh, what if I got it wrong?
I'm sure I did. I don't remember. I would go home sometimes at 2:00 at night. Remember those taxis we had alongside? And I'm sure I was worried about it because I was a fanatic about accuracy. And I took every step I possibly could to be accurate. And if I was working with anybody like researchers sometimes that I did, I made it clear to them that their responsibility was just as strong as mine, and they had to be accurate. That didn't keep me from making a mistake or two, but nevertheless, I tried hard.
Just a reminder to everybody that we're going to have some time for questions for Carol. And actually, there's a really good question from George Manis in the chat that I'm going to ask, because it's a variation of a question I was going to ask, which is, what are your thoughts about the impact of your 1966 story, The Jones Nobody Keeps Up With? I read how it is credited with publicizing the idea of a hedge fund and maybe even coining the term hedge fund.
Well, as you sound like I have never known whether that was true or not, whether I coined that term. But I did do an important story about A.W. Jones and his hedge fund, which I think I used those words in that. And it was very important in the sense that so many other Wall Streeters who really didn't know much about this animal went out and started their own hedge funds. And so that story became very important in the history of hedge funds, I think.
Yeah. Carol, you mentioned that, Time Inc. or Time Warner was not going to go on the record with you for your reportage about the AOL Time Warner merger. I think that a lot of us on this call have gone multiple rounds with corporate PR. In your time as a journalist, do you feel like the public relations apparatuses at companies has become even more professionalized and at the risk of sounding cheeky about it, less aligned with assisting journalists and more intent on blocking access and trying to say, well, let's just do this on background, as opposed to the way that you've been raised as a journalist, which is let's sit down and have an on the record conversation. And I'm not going to do quote checks. I'm not going to give you the right to do take backs. Over the course of your career, did you find the relationship between business journalist and corporation to get trickier?
I think I did. And I also know that if the story was important enough, you had to do it anyway, no matter what they said. And the one that I remember especially about that was a story about KKR that I did early in its history. Henry Kravis and his cousin would not cooperate, although they did let us give us a good picture or allow us to take a good picture that we could use on the cover. I always thought that was an interesting distinction. But I just went ahead and did the story without them. And in my thinking, it was an important story. And many, many years later, they came to me and asked me to do a story about KKR, obviously at a very different part of their life. And I was perfectly willing to do that. And once again, to say whatever was right to say.
Yeah. There's some other great questions coming into the chat, so I want to be able to get to those. This is a question from Caleb, who says, which CEO in the job today would you love to do a cover story on now? Who fascinates you?
Well, I'm probably not as well informed. I'm surely not as well as informed as I would have been if I had been, it was when I was at Fortune. And I'm having a hard time. Well, I suppose I would, like everybody, like to do a story about Elon Musk, but I don't think that I would be quite as magnanimous as many journalists have been about him. I probably wouldn't have made him Time Magazine's Person of the Year. I'm sorry, Stephanie, I just can't come up with a really good example.
No, that's all right. And Time has put villains on its cover before as Person of the Year. So it's not all to use Carol Loomis. It's not all the glory of Elon Musk. How did you pick your stories when you were at Fortune? When you were no longer being assigned pieces as a writer, but when you had the opportunity to pitch things to editors and sort of pick at one point you were really just doing feature stories. How did you determine what you wanted to write about?
Well, I tried to follow the news very carefully. Sometimes an editor would come up with a great idea. And sometimes I would get very seldom, but I would get a letter in the mail that was very helpful. I know I got a letter on Fireman's Fund that was from a mole at Fireman's Fund, and which was owned by American Express. And I did a big story about that, and they hated it. So that's the best example I can think of.
There's a question from Jason Zweig. Two questions, actually. One, how did you keep yourself fresh for such a long career? And how did you fight burn-off or feeling like you were getting stale?
Well, I think I must have been lucky. I've had a couple of ancestors who died at very late dates. I don't know, but most of the time I was okay with a schedule that I thought was pretty hard. But sometimes I would go home dead tired at night, as I'm sure you did also. And I would try to find a little bit later, a day or so I could take. And then I had a wonderful experience, which is that my managing editors began allowing me and one other woman, maybe more than one, to take 3 months off in the summer. And that was a glorious thing. And I will never forget that.
It's so interesting, Carol, that in even just the 25 years I've been covering business news, we've seen business kind of go from being a niche at a lot of news organizations to being front page news. But you'll see business news on broadcast television now. Do you have a point of view on what's changed? Has the rest of the world caught up to the importance of business and economic news, or and is that a good thing for outlets like Fortune and Fast Company and the Wall Street Journal as business news becomes more mainstream?
Well, I do think it's a good thing that that the world has become much more interested in business. Even though I hadn't thought of the opposite side of the coin, that it might be bad for somebody like Fortune or Business Week or Forbes. But I think in general that it's wonderful. There is more coverage of business and that it's gotten better. And I hope that continues to be true and that it turns up on these places that you were indicating.
Yeah, it's amazing that and the definition of business news has expanded so much. Workplace topics are, where everybody's talking about the Great Resignation. A lot of people are talking about inflation now, which is not something that you would often hear leading the news. So it's the world has come around to our way of looking at things.
Right, right. I still don't find much discussion about derivatives in these, which is such a tough topic, but one that I happen to have been interested in and got a chance to write about in Fortune. But I don't think I see much about derivatives these days.
Yeah, derivatives seems to have fallen out of favor as a topic, but since you raised it, again, you wrote sort of the very first story about derivatives that appeared in a mainstream publication. I'm sure there were perhaps newsletters and niche publications that delved into the topic. How did you get interested in derivatives? And then I remember that story so distinctly. You were able to break it down for the average reader in a way that was really understandable. How did you go about reporting that story in a way that would feel accessible?
Well, derivatives had become a hot topic, although you seldom found much elaboration and detail about them, and it was apparent that they weren't well understood. So that struck me as an ideal spot for Fortune to get into, a topic for it to get into, and I myself was interested in learning, and I was willing to take it on. And I just interviewed everybody I could find who had something to say about derivatives or could give me a good example. And I picked, and I think maybe many businesses creating derivatives were sort of glad that somebody was trying to actually explain them. And so that was a very challenging story. The two stories were very challenging, but I was really glad that I had a chance to do it. And I remember one thing that happened. A PR man at some bank, and I can't remember the name, but it's probably just as well, it told me that when reporters came into them and said, "We don't understand derivatives, could you explain them to us?" they would say, "Read Fortune's story." I think you'll know much better about them after you read Fortune's story. So that was a very nice thing to have happened.
Yeah, that's the highest compliment.
Yeah.
Another thing that is a real hallmark of your career, Carol, is that you've, I think I'm going to mix metaphors here, but you've deflated more than one sort of empty suit. You've really sort of, we talked a lot about your financial journalism, but you've also written about some people in business who have proven to be, what's the expression, all hat and no cattle. How do you go about, what's your process for evaluating the caliber of an executive and knowing if what they're selling is not something that investors should be buying?
Well, I think that only the deep reporting that Fortune tried to go in for allows you to know, because too often you just cannot tell from the outside what is the situation as to good or poor or misleading CEO. So I think it's a tough challenge too. I think the business press has a really tough challenge in trying to cover stories who really aren't seeking publicity, and would just assume they weren't accosted by a good journalist. But that's what makes the whole business so fascinating.
Do you recall how it was you came to write about Carly Fiorina? Was that a story that was assigned to you, or was that one that you you actively sought to write?
No, I remember that very well. I was home, I believe, on summer vacation. And Rick Kirkland called me up and said, Carol, I want you to do a story about Carly Fiorina. He said, most people really don't understand that story very well. They don't know whether she is great or a disaster. And we would like you to take on this subject. I always thought that maybe the advertising people at Timing had also been worried about this subject. Well, anyway, I was asked to take it on. I said, sure. So then I had a hard time doing the story. I remember taking 3 trips out to California. And it wasn't until I took the 3rd one that I realized what the story, that I could hang it on, which was that they themselves in their prospectus had made assertions about what was going to be happening by the time I was writing this story, and they were not producing anything like that. So I knew right then that while I was on that plane that I had my lead. So that was a tough story for me to do, but it worked all right, and I remember my editor liking it.
And it had quite an impact on the investors. I mean, they looked at the company in a new light and the management team in a new light.
Right, and she didn't hang around long thereafter, but certainly they did not agree. They did not think or said that that stories about HP had any effect.
Do you think that in particularly in the magazine world, where, you know, typically people want to see covers that are uplifting, they want to see figures they can admire in a lot of cases, that that you know, we're not hard enough on business figures, that that there's been in part because, you know, founders like Elon Musk have their own followings and have made so much money and are such figures of admiration for a new generation. Are business journalists, do you feel like we give too much of a pass to some of these cult-like figures?
Well, I'm not sure I know about this for sure now, because I'm not in my mind thinking at every moment about what should be my next story and what should I be suggesting to the managing editor. So I think I have to pass on that one. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm going to go to some of the questions, and there's some really great comments in the chat. So I'll just share them because I know it's hard for you to look at 2 screens at once. Alan Deutschman writes, "Hi, Carol. I just wanted to say hi. I worked as the researcher on one of your stories when I was starting out at Fortune in the late 80s and learned so much working with you. So it's great to see you on screen." That's from Alan.
Alan, thank you.
Adam Lashinsky writes, "Carol, given all the years you've covered Wall Street, give us your assessment of it. Good, bad, ugly."
I certainly don't think it's ugly. I think it's good material for business journalism or business journalists. But I think it plays an important role, and I think it does ugly things at some time, but that practically everybody does. So I don't think that should be necessarily held against Wall Street. I don't think it's bad at all. I think that a lot of investors are too much interested in short-term trading, but that's inevitable.
My colleague from Fast Company, Ainsley Harris, actually asked this question better than I just attempted to. So I'm gonna try it again with her version,
Okay.
Which is that CEOs are celebrities today as much as corporate executives. How can the press cover them in this dual role that they play while still holding them to account?
Well, I think that's an ideal situation for a Fortune, and it's for business journalists, is to to go deeply into that subject and find out what the truth is, and either say that it's bad or that it's good. And so I don't know that anybody but business journalists can actually carry out this work.
That's it's a good rallying cry. Ellen Kratz asks, Carol, what do you see as the biggest issue in corporate governance today?
I think there are many companies, or at least certainly some important number, that don't have much corporate governance at the top. The board of directors is not very good at monitoring the CEO, and that it's unfortunate. And why do I keep coming back? Because again, this is a really real opportunity for business journalists.
Do you have a take, Carol, on whether the push to separate the CEO from the chairman role, which became kind of a trendy thing a few years ago, has been effective as a governance tool? Do you think that's something that has helped? And what are some of the other things that you think boards can do?
Well, I just think that boards ought to see themselves as representatives of the shareholders and do that job well and carefully. And I don't have an opinion about the CEO and chairman. I think that probably has worked okay, as it should, when they were separated. But I'm sure that there have been internal problems, arguments, because this was a phenomenon that was out there and put into effect.
We have a question from Koyuchi. Koichi asks, Carol, what do you remember most about your time as a student at the Missouri School of Journalism, and how did Mizzou shape your career as a journalist?
Well, I have to give you just a tiny bit of background here. When I graduated from high school in this small town I came from, I went to Drury College, what's now Drury University in Springfield, Missouri, because my mother and all of her brothers had gone there. And then my interest in journalism just kept on growing. And I realized I needed to get to the University of Missouri. And so I transferred before my junior year and finished out at what we called the J School. And it was wonderful. It taught me so much. I truly believe that it's the best journalism school in the country, though I'm sure there are people in the audience already arguing with me on that. But Missouri is famous for its journalism school, and certainly in my case, it was the right place for me to be as I was trying to move from college into getting a job.
Had you declared a major at Drury?
At Drury, I had not, because you didn't have to declare a major until your junior year, and I did not have a major. I took a lot of econ and history courses. That's about all I can remember about it. It's a fine school, and it's still better even now.
Yeah, and you're a member of the Hall of Fame there, I believe.
Well, I believe that's right too.
Some intrepid researcher will fact check us, Carol. And when you were at Missouri, did you write for the school paper? Did you write for a school magazine? How did you work your muscle while you were at school?
Well, I did a little bit for the school newspaper, but I did not do much. And I took every magazine course, every course that had anything to do with magazines, because I really thought I belonged more at a magazine than I did as at a newspaper. And fortunately, that worked out well for me. They do a good job on both ends. But I was lucky to bear down whenever I could on courses that had something to do with magazines.
Carol, as I'm recalling your time at Fortune, one thing that struck me in watching you work was how closely you worked with the art and photo and design departments. That very often you had an idea for how to illustrate a story, and you would sometimes incorporate the illustration into the lead of your piece, which is not something a lot of business journalists do. Was that something that, again, you had observed other writers at Fortune do, or was that something that you just enjoyed, that you liked that collaboration with the visual storytelling?
Well, I think that was accidental on my part, but I think I was aware that Fortune had a great art department, great photography department, and in so many cases it made sense for it to be used, even though that was stealing words from the writer. But nevertheless, I was in favor of that.
We have time for two more questions. Ann Harrington, hi Ann. Ann asks, Carol, if you could have a conversation with your younger self as you were starting your time at Fortune, what advice would you give?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Well, I think I would still give the same advice I tried to follow myself, which was to realize that I was surrounded by people that who knew a lot more than I did, and by editors who were very good and should be listened to when they pointed out something. And I tried in every way. I remember one time asking one of the senior writers with whom I'd gone on an interview, which was one of the great things that happened to us. I remember saying to him, quite stupidly, "Oh, can you tell me how I go about getting as smart as you?" And he laughed, because that's really a stupid question. But I realized that part of what is just getting older and picking up every fact that you possibly, every idea that you can from other people around you about how to get smarter. So that's the best answer I can give you.
Thanks, Carol. The last question I have is actually Jason Zweig asked a version of it as well. I'll ask my question and then I'll ask Jason's. I was going to ask you to regale us with the story of the 2 dates you went on with Ty Cobb, and then Jason asks, did Ty Cobb have any redeeming qualities?
Well, I'm not. Did he have any redeeming qualities? Well, he asked me for a date, so I guess I have to include that. But well, it happened because I had been on a quiz show, and I had answered a few questions about baseball. I got some wrong. I remember that when I finally met him, he was horrified that I didn't know the number the shortstop was assigned. But anyway, that's why he had his nephew call me up and say, Ty Cobb would like to meet you. And I was enough of a baseball fan to be floored by that. And I said, well, okay, that's all right. He wanted to have lunch with me. That's right. I said, okay. And he said at 21. And I said, well, that would be very nice. And so that's how I met him. And of course, when the two of us went into 21, many people recognized him and were immediately awestruck by the fact that Ty Cobb was in there. And then he asked me to go to Yankee Stadium for the old timers game, and I did that. And then he asked me on a third date, and I decided it was time to stop this. So that was the end of my acquaintance with Ty Cobb.
Well, thank you for regaling us with those stories and for pointing out that he does have a redeeming quality, which is that he has excellent taste in lunch dates. Carol Loomis, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure and such a treat, and so wonderful to see you again and to see so many old friends in the chat. I'm going to turn things back over to Caleb.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was so delightful. Such a great conversation. Stephanie Mehta, we appreciate you doing this so much. I couldn't think of a better person to have had this conversation with, a true legend. And Carol, you are absolutely delightful and so inspiring. I know I got so much out of this, and folks on the chat, it was great to see so many old friends and colleagues joining in for this, because we're all here to honor you. We really, really do appreciate it. So thank you very much. And really an honor for us. And on behalf, thank you.
Very highly of Sabu, so that's great to be here and get this honor.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of Sabu, thank you for joining us today and tonight. 2 years ago, folks, we lost one of our own, Shauna Antunes. And Shauna was a Sabu board member, and she held executive editor roles at Fortune, at Quartz, at CNBC Digital, and at CNN Money, where I met her. We established a women leadership program in her name here at Sabu. Some of the fellows are on the call today. I know they were watching you, Carol. So inspired to hear from you. And if you want to find out more or you want to donate, go to sabu.org or the link on the screen there. That's the Shauna Fund, we like to call it. She's still so close to our hearts and such a special person and such a special journalist. So thank you for thinking about her at this time. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for Legends of Business News. We got another one coming up in February. I'm not going to say who it is yet, but I'm super excited. It's going to be very hard to come even close to what we've done here tonight with Carol Loomis. And our first conversation, in case you missed it, was with Myron Kandel, the legendary business journalist. I think he was on tonight's call as well, my hero as well. So many heroes that we have to honor. We look forward to doing more of these series throughout the year. So stay tuned to what's going on at Sabu to find out what's up with our Legends of Business News interview series. We got our spring conference coming up. We have our ongoing webinars that we're constantly doing. A lot going on at Sabu, so check us out at sabu.org. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you, Carol Loomis, for being here with us tonight.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, thank you, Carol. Have a great night, everyone.
Okay.